The final countdown. The air was thick with tension. The clock above the command center ticked relentlessly, echoing in the silent room like the steady beat of a drum. It was the final countdown. Outside, the battlefield stretched for miles, a desolate land scarred by years of war. The sound of distant explosions and the hum of weapons fire filled the air, a constant reminder that the battle had raged on for over a decade. But now, things were different. Today, it would end. Inside the command room, a group of cadets, young but hardened by the brutal training of Deathworld, prepared for what could be their final mission. They were humans, a species thought weak and unremarkable by the galaxy's other inhabitants, but they were about to prove everyone wrong. They were ready. The mission would not only determine their survival, but the future of their civilization. Jace, the team leader, stood in front of the other cadets, his eyes scanning the map displayed on the large screen. The plan was simple, or at least it seemed so. Their objective was clear: break through the enemy's defenses and strike at the heart of their command center. Destroy the leadership. The enemy had long been their greatest adversary, a relentless force that had outlasted every other species in the galaxy. They had crushed hundreds of enemies over the course of the war, but now it was time for them to fall. The cadets were nervous, but none showed it. Their training had prepared them for this moment. They were not just soldiers, they were Deathworlder cadets, trained on the deadliest planet in the galaxy. They were survivors. They were the best of the best. Jace turned to his team, his voice low but steady. "We're about to do something no one thought was possible. We're going to end this war today. Our people are counting on us. Let's make them proud." A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Despite their nerves, they knew this was their chance to prove themselves, to show that humans were not to be underestimated. They were not just space monkeys anymore. They were warriors, and they had a fight to finish. The seconds on the clock seemed to stretch, and a tense silence settled in the room. Outside, the world was ready for battle, and so were they. The team was prepared. They had studied every inch of the enemy's fortress, learned their routines, and knew their weaknesses. They had everything they needed to succeed, but one thing was clear: they had no idea what awaited them on the other side. The cadets stood in their battle armor, their weapons in hand. Each one was focused, their faces a mixture of resolve and determination. They had all been through hell to get here, and this mission was more than just a job. It was their test, their chance to be remembered in history. Jace's thoughts flashed to the faces of the civilians back home, the families they were fighting to protect, the ones who had lived under the shadow of this war for far too long. For them, this was the final chance to bring peace, to end the cycle of suffering that had plagued their world. He could feel the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders, but he knew that the cadets standing with him were ready for the challenge. Together, they could do this. "All systems are green," the technician at the back of the room called out, his voice breaking the silence. "You're good to go." With a nod from Jace, the team moved into position. They exited the command room and made their way toward the shuttle bay. The halls of the base were eerily quiet, the only sound the quick steps of the cadets and the hum of the overhead lights. As they reached the shuttle bay, the doors slid open, revealing their transport. The shuttle was sleek, dark, and built for speed. It had been designed for precision, able to slip through enemy radar and land undetected. It was their lifeline. If they could make it through the defenses, they would have a chance at reaching the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Jace turned to face his team one last time before they boarded the shuttle. "This is it. We get in, we take them down, and we get out. No heroics, no hesitation. We're in this together." With one final nod, the cadets boarded the shuttle, and the doors closed behind them. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle rose into the air. Outside, the battlefield stretched endlessly, the sounds of war louder now, as though the enemy had been waiting for them all along. As the shuttle broke through the atmosphere and made its way toward the enemy's planet, The team couldn't help but feel the weight of the mission pressing on them. Every second counted. The clock was ticking, and they were about to step into the unknown. Jace looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the planet below. It was a dark, inhospitable world, scared by years of war. The enemy had turned it into their stronghold, and for years, the humans had struggled to break through. Now, with just 1 hour left, they were about to make their move. The cadets braced themselves as the shuttle entered the planet's atmosphere, preparing for what could be the most difficult battle of their lives. In the distance, the enemy's fortress loomed, a massive structure of steel and stone, impregnable and foreboding. But the cadets were ready. They had trained for this. They were Deathworlder cadets, and they weren't about to let anything stop them now. The countdown was almost over. It was time to end the war. Breaking the line. The shuttle's hull shook as it entered the hostile planet's atmosphere, the turbulence growing stronger with each passing second. The cadets inside were silent, their expressions focused, but their minds racing. They had trained for this moment, prepared for every possible scenario. Yet nothing could quite prepare them for the reality of being in the heart of enemy territory. The shuttle's dark interior hummed with tension as they approached their destination. Jace stood at the front, his hand gripping the console. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his face remained calm. His team depended on him to lead them, and he couldn't afford to let fear show. Behind him, the other cadets were preparing, securing their gear, double-checking their weapons, and reviewing the mission plans. Every detail mattered. One mistake could cost them everything. The shuttle's AI spoke in a steady, mechanical tone. Approaching target zone. 30 seconds to drop off. Jace nodded, his mind already ahead, visualizing the plan. Their mission was to infiltrate the enemy's base and sabotage their command center. The fortress they were about to storm had been the key to the enemy's dominance for the past decade. It was the heart of their operations, and if they could take it down, they would break the enemy's will to fight. The shuttle jolted again, this time more violently. The cadets braced themselves, their bodies tensing as the planet's gravity pulled them down. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the ship leveled off, hovering just above the ground. Jace knew they were nearing the landing zone, the last barrier before they would face the enemy head-on. "Steady," Jace whispered, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the view outside. The terrain was harsh and rugged, a desolate wasteland dotted with craters and wreckage from the endless battles that had raged here. The enemy fortress was not far now. The shuttle's engines powered down, and the landing ramp dropped with a heavy thud. The cold air of the planet rushed inside, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. Jace took a deep breath and turned to face his team. "It's go time," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. The cadets filed out, their boots crunching on the dry, cracked ground. The atmosphere here was thick with tension. They had no idea how long they had before the enemy noticed their arrival, so they needed to move fast. Team Alpha, move to the east flank. Beta, take the west. Stay low. We need to stay out of sight until we're in position," Jace ordered, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm outside. The cadets spread out, moving swiftly and silently. Their training had prepared them for this, the stealth, the tactics, the precision. They were like shadows in the night, moving quickly through the barren landscape, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Jace led his team through the rocky terrain, carefully watching the sky for any sign of enemy patrols. The last thing they needed was to be spotted before they even got close. The enemy's defenses were extensive, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. The first obstacle came sooner than expected. As they neared the edge of the fortress, a patrol of enemy soldiers appeared on the horizon. They moved in tight formation, their armored suits gleaming under the light of the distant sun. The cadets dropped to the ground, instinctively taking cover behind the jagged rocks. Jace's heart raced as he observed the enemy. "We can't let them see us," Jace whispered, his voice barely audible. "Wait for them to pass. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Jace could hear the soft click of the soldiers' boots as they marched past, their heavy steps shaking the ground beneath them. The cadets held their breath, their bodies tense, waiting for the perfect moment to move. Finally, the patrol passed without noticing them. Jace let out a silent breath of relief, but there was no time to waste. The enemy was everywhere, and the clock was ticking. They had to reach the heart of the fortress before the command center went into lockdown. "Move out," Jace said, his voice barely a whisper. The cadets swiftly made their way toward the entrance of the enemy base, sticking to the shadows and staying low. Every step was calculated. Every movement was deliberate. They couldn't afford to make a sound. The fate of the war rested on their shoulders, and failure was not an option. As they approached the entrance, Jace's thoughts flashed back to their training. The cadets had been pushed to their limits, forced to endure hardships that no other soldier had ever experienced. They had survived Deathworld, a planet that was known for its deadly environment and harsh conditions, but none of that had prepared them for what lay ahead. The fortress was a fortress for a reason. The enemy was powerful, ruthless, and prepared to defend their territory with everything they had. But the cadets were different. They weren't just soldiers. They were Deathworlders. They were survivors. "Stay focused. We breach in 5, Jace said, his voice low and firm. The cadets nodded, their faces grim but determined. They could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on them, but they refused to let it overwhelm them. They had come this far, and they would not back down. The countdown began. They were about to make history. With a final glance at his team, Jace moved into position, ready to breach the walls of the enemy's fortress. The mission had just begun, and nothing was going to stop them now. Breaking the line. The sharp crack of weapons fire echoed in the distance as Jace and his team reached the entrance to the fortress. The ground beneath their boots trembled with the shockwaves of explosions that rippled through the planet's desolate surface. They were close now, too close for mistakes. There was no turning back. Jace raised his hand, signaling for his team to stop. The entrance to the enemy stronghold was a massive, imposing structure made of dark, metallic plating. It was heavily guarded by automated turrets, each one scanning for any sign of movement. A thick, shimmering force field surrounded the base, making it virtually impenetrable. Jace's eyes narrowed as he studied the force field. He knew they couldn't waste time trying to figure out how to disable it. "Team Alpha, we're going in hot," Jace commanded. "Beta, get those turrets down." The two teams split, moving with the fluidity of a well-oiled machine. Jace's team made their way to a concealed position near the entrance, their eyes scanning the environment for any threats. They were mere moments from breaching the stronghold, and the pressure was building. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, but he pushed the nerves away. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment they would show the galaxy just how unstoppable they were. The rest of the team moved into position behind cover, each cadet readying their weapons. Jace glanced over at his second-in-command, a young woman named Rhea. She was calm, her rifle held steady in her hands, her expression determined. She gave him a small nod, signaling that she was ready. Jace looked to the sky. The enemy's aerial drones were circling overhead, their engines buzzing like angry bees. They had to be neutralized if they wanted to breach the gates without being noticed. Rhea took aim, her sharp eyes tracking the movement of the drones. "Take the left," Jace ordered. "I'll cover the right." Rhea nodded, smoothly shifting into position. With a single, fluid motion, she fired. The shot rang out, a silent whisper of death that hit its target with precision. One of the drones exploded in a burst of sparks, its pieces scattering in the wind. The other drones reacted quickly, diving toward them in an effort to retaliate. But they were too late. Jace's rifle let out a sharp crack, taking down the second drone before it could even begin its descent. The enemy hadn't noticed them yet. Jace took another breath, focusing on the task at hand. Their entry had been flawless so far, but they were still far from success. The real test would begin once they were inside. "Team, on me," Jace barked, and the cadets began moving swiftly toward the entrance. They weren't far from the gates now, just a few meters away. They had to be precise. One misstep, and the whole mission could fail. As they reached the gate, Jace gave a quick look to the security system. It was armed with high-tech defenses, laser grids, and pressure-sensitive floors. But the cadets had been trained for this. They knew how to get through any obstacle. "Rhea, handle the grid. Ty, stand by for backup," Jace instructed. Rhea moved to the panel beside the gate, her fingers dancing over the controls. The red light above the door flashed once, then turned green. With a smooth hiss, the massive doors opened, revealing the dark interior of the enemy fortress. The air inside was thick with the stench of machinery and dampness. The walls were adorned with alien symbols, their meanings lost to the human mind. A low hum resonated through the structure, the sound of a well-oiled machine working tirelessly to maintain its operation. Jace motioned for his team to enter. They slipped inside one by one, their movements silent but quick. As the last of them crossed the threshold, Jace gave a signal for them to halt. "Eyes up," Jace muttered. "We're in." The fortress was eerily quiet. Not a single sound of movement could be heard, but Jace knew better than to let his guard down. This was the calm before the storm. The enemy was here, they just hadn't revealed themselves yet. "Set up the perimeter," Jace said, his voice low. "We're going to find that command center, and we're going to make sure they know what happens when you mess with Deathworlders." The cadets spread out, checking every corner of the room. Every time their boots hit the cold metal floors, the sound reverberated throughout the entire facility, heightening the tension. There were security cameras in every corner, but none of them had detected their entry. The element of surprise was still in their favor. Jace focused on the mission ahead. They had come this far, and there was no room for failure. The enemy had underestimated them for years, but they would soon learn that underestimating humans, Deathworlders, was the gravest mistake they could make. Rhea approached, her eyes scanning a nearby panel. "We found the main power supply," she whispered. "Once we disable it, the whole base will be in lockdown. They'll have no way to call for backup." Jace nodded. The plan was simple: disrupt the enemy's operations, disable the power, and take down their command center before they could react. They only had one shot at this, and they couldn't afford to waste it. The seconds felt like minutes as they prepared. They knew what was at stake. The lives of countless beings depended on them. They were the last hope. If they failed, the war would continue. If they succeeded, the tide would turn in their favor. "Ready?" Jace asked, his voice steady. The cadets responded with grim nods. Without another word, they moved. The countdown had begun. It was now or never. The battle for the future of the galaxy was about to begin. The breach. The air inside the enemy fortress grew colder, the silence thick enough to suffocate. Every breath Jace took seemed to echo in the cold, dark hallways. The cadets moved swiftly, their footfalls light but deliberate. Every step brought them closer to their objective, the heart of the fortress, where the enemy's command center awaited. As they navigated through the maze-like corridors, Jace's mind raced. The plan was simple, but the stakes were enormous. They were only a few minutes from disabling the power supply, but once they did, there would be no turning back. The countdown to the end of the war would have begun. The faint hum of the machinery grew louder as they neared the core. Jace stopped in front of a large metal door, its surface lined with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. This was it, the entrance to the command center. He motioned for the team to halt, signaling for a quick check of their gear. Each cadet ensured their weapons were locked and loaded, their helmets securely fastened, and their comms channels clear. A quick glance to his right revealed Rhea, her expression unreadable, but her stance ready for action. "Rhea," Jace whispered, "what's the status on the power grid?" She crouched by a nearby terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. "I'm almost there. Once we disrupt it, the whole facility will be locked down. No communications, no reinforcements. We'll have complete control." "Good. Everyone, stay sharp. We make our move as soon as Rhea gets the signal," Jace said, his voice steady but laced with tension. The seconds stretched, the quiet of the base pressing down on him. Suddenly, a crackling sound broke the silence. "Got it," Rhea said, her voice calm but firm. "Power's down." Before Jace could respond, the metallic door to the command center slid open with a low groan. The Cadets moved as one, silently flowing into the room like a well-practiced dance. The room was vast, a towering structure of glowing monitors and complex machinery. But the real threat was ahead. At the far end of the room, perched on a platform above, sat the enemy command leader, flanked by two heavily armed guards. Jace's breath caught in his throat. The enemy had anticipated this. They were prepared for the breach. "Cadets, weapons free," Jace barked. The air was instantly filled with the sharp staccato of gunfire as the Cadets opened fire. The guards fell back, caught off guard by the rapid onslaught. Jace didn't wait to see if they'd been taken down. He was already moving forward, his rifle raised, eyes locked on the target. The command leader, a towering alien with sharp, angular features, growled in frustration. His golden eyes burned with fury, but there was also something else. Fear. He hadn't expected humans to be this efficient, this deadly. The Deathworlders were more than he had bargained for. Jace charged forward, his team following closely behind. They moved with precision, taking down every guard in their path. The alien leader was scrambling, reaching for a weapon that was just out of his grasp. The air was thick with tension as Jace leaped forward, tackling the enemy leader to the ground. "End of the line," Jace muttered under his breath. The alien leader struggled beneath him, his claws slashing at Jace's armor. But the human cadet was unstoppable. With a swift movement, Jace raised his weapon and fired. The blast was quick and lethal, silencing the enemy leader forever. For a moment, the room was still. The sound of battle ceased as the last of the guards fell, their bodies scattered across the room. The Cadets stood in the silence, their chests heaving from the exertion. "We did it," Rhea said quietly, her voice full of disbelief. "The war is over." Jace didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept across the room, ensuring there were no more threats lurking in the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no time to relax. "Not yet." "Not yet," Jace said softly, his eyes narrowing. "We've taken the command center, but we need to ensure they can't retaliate. Prepare the charge. This place is coming down." The Cadets quickly moved into action, planting explosives throughout the command center. There was no time to waste. Once they activated the charges, the entire base would be obliterated, and no enemy would ever threaten the galaxy again. Jace glanced up at the glowing screens around him, the information they displayed now irrelevant. The war was over. The Deathworlders had won, and the universe would never forget their strength. As the last explosive was set, Jace looked at his team, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They had done the impossible. They had ended a decade-long war in less than an hour. "Time to go," he said, his voice filled with finality. The countdown had begun, and this time it was the Deathworlders who had the last word. The countdown. The countdown timer on Jace's wrist was ticking down, each second dragging like an eternity. The hum of the power generators and the soft beeping of the explosives charging filled the air. There was no turning back now. The room was silent, save for the tense breathing of the Cadets, their faces lit by the glow of the countdown clock. The pressure was almost unbearable, but Jace knew there was no time to waste. Their mission was almost complete, but the enemy still had their last hope: an emergency escape protocol that could bring reinforcements in a matter of minutes. "We've planted the charges. Now we move fast," Jace said, his voice firm. Rhea, standing by the terminal, punched in the final sequence of codes, ensuring that the facility's power grid would remain down. The destruction was imminent, but they had to finish it off. With a swift nod from Jace, the cadets quickly advanced toward the exit, moving in a coordinated, synchronized formation. The hallway they had just passed through was now filled with the sound of the enemy scrambling, trying to mount a defense, but it was already too late. They were trapped. Jace's mind raced as they neared the exit. The stakes were higher now. The countdown on his wrist had reached the final 30 seconds. 30 seconds until the end of the war, until the Deathworlders had decisively crushed the enemy. But the last hurdle stood before them. The massive blast doors that sealed off the exit. They were heavily reinforced, designed to withstand even the most powerful explosions. Jace knew the only way out was through the blast door. There was no other path. "Blast doors ahead," Jace barked to his team. "Rhea, can you hack it?" Rhea's fingers flew across the terminal, her eyes scanning the data as if it were second nature. The tension in the room grew as every cadet turned their gaze to her, waiting for a sign, her brow furrowed with concentration. "I need 10 more seconds," she replied, her voice calm but the intensity clear in her eyes. Jace counted the seconds in his head, his heart pounding in his chest. The countdown on his wrist continued relentlessly. 20 seconds. He could already hear the faint sound of enemy soldiers coming from the hallway behind them, their footsteps growing louder by the second. Just as the timer on Jace's wrist ticked to 15 seconds, the blast door began to rumble. Rhea had broken through. "It's open. Let's go," she yelled. Without hesitation, Jace sprinted toward the door, his team following closely behind. The door opened wide enough for them to slip through, but the room beyond was filled with blaring alarms and flashing red lights. The enemies were now fully aware of their presence, but it was too late. The Deathworlders were already on their way to victory. The cadets moved through the darkened corridor, knowing they had only moments before the explosion would engulf the facility. The countdown had reached its final seconds. "Stay close. We need to move fast," Jace called out, leading the way toward the rendezvous point. There was no turning back. They were leaving destruction in their wake, but it was for the greater good of the galaxy. The Deathworlders had come to the universe's defense, and the enemy had underestimated them. It was time for the war to end. With just 5 seconds left, they reached the rendezvous point. The final part of their mission, evacuation, was almost complete. The countdown reached its last second. Boom. The entire base shook, the ground beneath them trembling as a massive explosion rocked the facility. The flames and smoke billowed from the structure, visible even from where they stood. The universe would never forget the Deathworlders' final stand. Jace, breathless but resolute, looked at his team. They had done the impossible. "The war is over," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pride. They had crushed a decade-long conflict in just 1 hour. The universe would never forget the strength of the Deathworlders. As they watched the explosion consume the enemy fortress, Jace couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning. The Deathworlders had proven themselves, and the galaxy would soon understand that their legend had only just begun. The aftermath. The destruction was complete. The roar of the explosion echoed across the barren landscape, signaling the end of the war. But even as the smoke billowed from the shattered facility, there was no time to savor the victory. The Deathworlder cadets were quick to recognize the gravity of their next challenge, surviving the aftermath. Jace surveyed the surroundings. The winds howled through the devastated battlefield, whipping up dust and ash. The once mighty fortress of the enemy now lay in ruins, but there was no comfort in the victory. There were still soldiers and war machines, remnants of the enemy forces scattered across the region. "We need to move. The enemy will regroup soon," Jace ordered, his voice sharp and decisive. The mission was complete, but the war had left scars, And it wasn't over until they were safe. The cadets quickly regrouped, scanning the horizon for any signs of the remaining enemy forces. Despite the explosive victory, the mission had come at a cost. They had suffered losses along the way. Some of their best had fallen in battle, and the weight of it was starting to settle on their shoulders. Rhea, her face stained with dust, turned to Jace, eyes burning with the same intensity that had driven them all through the operation. "Do you think they'll understand what we've done?" she asked. "Will they see us as heroes or just killers?" Jace paused, his gaze unwavering. The weight of their actions wasn't lost on him. They had taken lives, destroyed entire facilities, and wreaked havoc on a scale that could not be undone. But in his heart, Jace knew that they had done what needed to be done. "History will decide," Jace said quietly. "But it's not about what they think of us. It's about what we've done for the universe. The war ends today, and we've made sure it stays that way." As they moved deeper into the battlefield, the cadets kept their eyes peeled, moving with precision. They had no idea how much longer they could stay undetected. The enemy's final line of defense had been shattered, but there were still pockets of resistance, and the last thing they needed was a retaliatory strike. "Keep moving," Jace called out, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't afford to stop now." The Deathworlder cadets had become legends in their own right, but their battle wasn't just against the enemy. It was against time, against every obstacle that the universe had thrown their way. The war was over, but the struggle for survival continued. Suddenly, a familiar voice crackled through Jace's communication device. It was their commanding officer, Captain Illara. "Jace, report. What's your status?" Jace exhaled deeply, relieved to hear a familiar voice. "Mission complete, Captain. The facility is destroyed. The enemy is scattered. We're heading for extraction now." "Good work, Cadet, but don't get comfortable. We've received intel that the enemy might try to regroup. You'll need to move quickly to the extraction point. We'll send a shuttle, but the area is still unstable." Jace's pulse quickened. They were not yet safe, not until they were on their way off this battlefield. "Understood. We're on our way," Jace replied, signaling for the cadets to pick up the pace. The next few minutes felt like hours as they maneuvered through the treacherous terrain. The cadets had been trained for this. Every step, every decision was crucial. They were now not only fighting for victory, but also fighting for their own lives. They knew what was at stake. But even as they pushed forward, something stirred in Jace's mind. The war had been brutal, the losses heavy, but there was a lingering question. What came next? The universe was vast, and the Deathworlders had proven their might. But what would the galaxy think of them now? Would they be welcomed as the heroes they were, or would they be seen as nothing more than dangerous forces to be reckoned with? "Jace," Rhea said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "We're close. I can see the extraction zone ahead." Jace nodded, a faint smile on his lips. It wasn't over yet, but with every step they took toward the extraction point, the war they had fought so hard to end became a part of the past. The Deathworlders had made their mark, and now they would be remembered. The universe had witnessed their power, their strength, and their resolve. But the ultimate question remained. How would the galaxy react to the legends they had created? As the cadets reached the extraction zone, the sound of a shuttle approaching could be heard in the distance. Their journey was far from over, but for now, they had won. And the universe would never forget the day the Deathworlder cadets changed the course of history. The war had ended, but the story of the Deathworlders was just beginning. A new dawn. The extraction shuttle descended slowly, its engines humming as it cut through the smoky skies above the devastated battlefield. The cadets, battered and worn, stood in formation, waiting. They had completed their mission. They had ended a decade of war in just 1 hour, but they weren't sure what awaited them back home. Their victory was not just about tactical brilliance. It was about something much more profound. Jace stood at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon. His heart was heavy, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that they had made a difference. Their enemies were no longer a threat, but the cost had been high. The sky, which had once been filled with the sounds of laser fire and the chaos of war, was now eerily quiet. But peace, Jace knew, was a fragile thing. The universe was vast, and there would always be new challenges, new threats. The Deathworlders had proven themselves capable of handling any battle, but they had also become symbols of something more. The shuttle's engines whined as it touched down, its landing gear settling firmly on the scorched earth. The doors hissed open, and the waiting cadets stepped forward. Their commanding officers were there, including Captain Elara, who looked at them with a mixture of pride and concern. "Good work, cadets," Elara said, her voice low but filled with respect. "You've done the impossible. The war is over, and the universe will remember your names." The cadets exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They had been trained for this moment, but now that it had come, they were unsure of how to feel. It was one thing to fight a war, to endure hardships, but it was another to live in the aftermath. Would they be seen as heroes, or would the galaxy regard them with fear? Jace looked around at his team, Rhea, Zeke, and the others. They had all seen the horrors of war, and yet they had stood strong. They had fought together as one. And now, their unity would be their greatest asset as they moved forward into an uncertain future. "Let's get out of here," Jace said, his voice steady as he turned toward the shuttle. The cadets boarded the shuttle in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As the door closed behind them, they could see the remnants of the battlefield fading into the distance. The war was over, but it had left a mark on each of them that would never fade. As the shuttle began its ascent, Captain Elara's voice echoed through the comms. "The war may be over, but the real fight begins now. The galaxy will never be the same. You've all earned your place in history, but it's what comes next that will define you." Jace nodded in acknowledgement. They had done the impossible, but now they had to live with the consequences of their actions. They had shattered a decade-long war in just 60 minutes, but what would the universe make of the Deathworlder's new role? In the quiet of the shuttle, as the stars outside began to blur into streaks of light, Jace thought about the future. He had seen his team face down insurmountable odds and come out victorious. He had seen them fight through pain and loss, driven by the same relentless spirit. But the journey wasn't over. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be new wars to fight, new challenges to overcome. But for now, the universe had learned one thing: never underestimate the Deathworlders. As the shuttle's engines hummed steadily, Jace allowed himself a moment of peace. They had done what no one thought possible. The war was over, but the story of the Deathworlders was only just beginning. And in that quiet moment, Jace knew that whatever came next, the Deathworlders would face it together. The universe had seen their strength, and they would never be forgotten. The galaxy had been changed forever, and now the Deathworlders would shape the future.